We're excited to learn more about San Francisco local politics and the mayoral race and your position on several issues.
Sure.
We wanted to give you a few minutes to do a sort of 5-minute introduction.
Sure.
And then we'll get some questions from me, and then open up to 15 or 20 minutes questions from the audience.
Great. And by the way, when you ask questions, I'd love to learn just a little bit about yourself too, without taking up too much time. But my name is Jane Kim. I have had the honor of representing actually this district on the Board of Supervisors, which includes South of Market, Mission Bay, Tenderloin, and Treasure Island. And I've actually spent a little over the last decade serving our city as an elected. I started out on the school board and then went on to serve on the Board of Supervisors. And prior to joining elected office, I spent 6 years as a youth and families community organizer in Chinatown, working with families that largely live on the east side of town, so all the way from Chinatown and North Beach, all the way down to Bayview and Portola. And after that, served as an attorney at Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, doing voter access, voter protection work, in particular on behalf of Latino and Asian American communities. The district that I represent is a district that actually most people are very familiar with. It's a very dynamic district. I represent the poorest residents of San Francisco, and as of 3 years ago, I now also represent the wealthiest zip code as well. Almost every single adult homeless shelter is in the district that I represent, and that has always been the case. And now almost every single tech company that you've heard of, from Uber and Salesforce and Square, are also in the district that I represent. The district I represent is currently overseeing close to 80% of San Francisco's commercial and residential development. But I'm also really proud of the fact that through our work and also my predecessor on the Board of Supervisors, we're also building 54% of all of San Francisco's affordable housing. And people often ask me what affordable means. And under federal HUD guidelines, it is for families that make roughly under $120,000 a year. And actually something that people don't often know is that 60% of San Franciscans qualify for affordable housing under federal HUD guidelines, which is pretty extraordinary. I've also spent quite a bit of time over the last couple of years in particular fighting to get more middle-class housing built. And we define middle class in the city roughly as families of four that make between $80,000 and $150,000 a year. And honestly, when I joined the board, I never thought I'd be fighting for families that make really good income, but can no longer afford to live in San Francisco because housing has become so expensive. I spent quite a bit of time also working on tenant issues. Also was the author of the Fight for 15, our minimum wage ordinance, which is raising the wages of our minimum wage workers to $15 an hour. And for all the ladies in the room, I always talk about economic equity as being a women's issue because 2/3 of minimum wage workers are women. In fact, the lowest paid workers across the country tend to be women workers. Also was the author of the initiative that has now made San Francisco the only city in the country to make community college free for all of our residents. And this was a particularly important initiative to me. Many of you are in technology, so you know a lot about, and probably think a lot about the future of work. I don't think government is thinking enough about the future of work. And we know that already without automation and algorithms and robots that 70% of US jobs by 2020 will require some type of post-secondary degree or certificate. And in order to get a middle-class job, you need more than a high school diploma. When this country actually made their initial decision, and by the way, this was a very radical decision at the time and a very expensive decision. When we decided to make this decision to fund a free and universal K-12 education system, we did that because we thought that that was the basis or foundation of what we need to provide our citizens to have a workable nation. And during that time, in the mid-20th century, a high school diploma was enough to get a middle-class job. And in fact, through the 1970s, middle-class Americans outnumbered those in the upper and low-income bracket. And funding a free and universal K-12 education system was a big part of that. Now the middle class is shrinking, both in San Francisco and throughout the country. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what does it mean to regrow a middle class again and support our working class communities. And making community college free was one of those initiatives that's one of the ways that we can work on those issues. But anyway, I thought I would just start with that and just open up for questions so I can address topics that folks here want to hear about.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. We have a few questions that people have sent in, and then we definitely want to open up the floor questions.
Okay.
Some of the first ones touch on homelessness, which you mentioned. You were very vocal about cleaning the streets recently.
Yeah.
Some of your supporters have said that you have a thoughtful, systemic approach to homelessness. It's much simpler than just getting rid of tents. And so I wanted to hear more about sort of what you think some solutions could be, and also what roadblocks you anticipate going forward.
So when I talk about homelessness, I think it's often important to, I realize that some people in the back probably can't see me, that it's important to,
You can stand up.
I'll stand, that it's important to understand the history of homelessness in this country. There was a time in our nation when the federal government was in the business of building housing. Between 1940 and 1980, at our peak, HUD's budget was larger than the Department of Defense. And the federal government built a ton of housing across the country. And in San Francisco alone, built 6,000 units of subsidized housing for low-income and middle-income households. And through the 1970s, actually, we used to have more public housing units than people on the wait list. And when people became homeless, and it was not a phenomenon in the country during that time, we used to house people rapidly, often within days. And those who became homeless actually tended to be white men with actually alcohol and drug issues. In 1980, President Reagan, then President Reagan, running under this guise of small government and smaller government, passed one of the biggest tax breaks at that point in American history on the richest individuals and corporations. And part of how he funded it was by defunding HUD. And actually, over 3 presidential administrations, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton, HUD's budget was cut by 50%. And since 1980 till now, the federal government has only built 1,000 units of publicly subsidized housing here in San Francisco. And there's this great graph online that shows as HUD's budget goes down, homelessness as an urban phenomenon in crisis across American cities rises. And this really began in the 1980s. And 40 years later, we're really dealing with the decisions of administrations 40 years ago that has seen a dramatic increase of people living in our streets. So, you know, homelessness today here in San Francisco, people hate hearing this, and but it is true. We're considered a success story across the country because we're one of the few cities that has not seen a dramatic increase in homelessness. Our homeless count has gone up, but has largely roughly stayed the same. It's about 7,000 people on any given night that either sleep in our streets or sleep in our shelters. City of Los Angeles, homeless count went up 70% in the last 5 years. New York City went up about 20 or 25% in the last 5 years. And so San Francisco actually has done a decent job of housing people. The problem is that as we house people, new people end up on our streets. So that's kind of the academic answer. But what we're seeing on our streets is still completely unacceptable. So our true homeless count is actually far larger than 7,000. It's about 17,000 people. It's about 17,000 unique individuals that interface with San Francisco's homeless support services on any given year. But if you are homeless, you may not necessarily be sleeping on the streets every night. You may have a car that you sleep in, you have friends that you couch surf in, you might scrounge up some money for a hotel on some nights, and end up on the streets on other nights. But on any given night, we know 7,000 people sleep in our streets or our shelters. Of that 7,000, there's roughly 3,000 that we count as chronically homeless. So these are the folks that you all see, living in tent encampments, probably very sick, also issues of substance abuse. And that is actually probably one of the more intractable and challenging populations in our homeless count that we have to address. I decided to stay in one of our homeless shelters, and I'm actually the only elected official that's done that because I wanted to see what the system was like for people that live on our streets. So I actually went through the reservation system, I waited online, I got assigned a shelter in my district, and I learned a tremendous amount in the 14 hours that I stayed in that shelter. The first thing I saw, just by pure observation, is that people are far older and far sicker than I had realized. And shelters were built for someone like me. Able-bodied, mentally well, just down on my luck, and all I need is a bed and a roof over my head for a couple of weeks, couple of months till I get my feet back up. That is not who's staying in our shelter. People in our shelter are very sick, and the minimum wage staff members that we pay to be in our shelter don't actually have the training or capacity to address the population that's coming in. So they're also very angry, frustrated, and there's a lot of turnover amongst our homeless shelter staff. So a couple of things I've done. One, I fought for and I won full-time nurses that are now at all of our single adult homeless shelters. And by the way, they are doing amazing work. I visited them. And people who live on our streets need to see a nurse every single day. Not once a week, not once a month, not once a year like you and I might. They need to see a nurse every single day. Two, I spent the last couple of years working with Mayor Edley before he passed away, and we built a 24-hour medical shelter in my district. So this is a shelter that's staffed by nurses, clinicians, and psychologists. It's only 75 beds, but it's a start. I think in the long term, what we have to be committed to is taking at least 50% of the 3,000 chronically homeless people off of our streets. And the city can do that. Within our existing budget, we can build 1,500 more shelter beds and take the sickest people off of our streets and provide them more medical support so that we can transition them into permanent housing. But the long-term answer is, of course, more affordable and subsidized housing. And for the rest of the homeless count, and by the way, the fastest growing demographic in our homeless count is actually families. It's working families with jobs and children. And it's really actually single mothers with children and job. That's the fastest growing segment, both in San Francisco, New York, and LA. We have a lot of work to do around building more housing, increasing rent subsidies so we can keep families in place in their homes.
Thanks. I think housing is going to be a huge topic.
Yeah, I've heard.
As it is this election cycle, I have both housing and traffic on the list of topics to get through. So I wanted to briefly touch on traffic. They're fairly related. Okay. And see if you wanted to comment on a citywide network of protected bike lanes and sort of what that might mean for traffic congestion. Is there other things that we could do for congestion in the city? I also want to couch things by saying we promised your staff that we'd get you out of here at 45 after, and so my phone's telling me that we need to open it up for audience questions pretty soon. Okay.
Yeah, so we the Chronicle is sponsoring a mayoral debate of the candidates at 6, which is why I have to get going to that debate. So transportation. Transportation and housing are absolutely sisters. They're linked, and you have to work on both issues. And I do support kind of the big projects that the region needs. So a second trans bay for BART or for Caltrain, the extension of Caltrain to downtown area, electrification, which will increase frequency and speed, and high-speed rail, along with the extension of Central Subway, which currently only goes to Chinatown, and extending it all the way to Fisherman's Wharf. But we know that these projects will take 10, probably 20 years to build out, and they're incredibly expensive. I love subways, but they take 30 years to build, and they cost billions of dollars. So what do we do in the meantime? One, I has said that we need to fund more buses and longer buses. Buses are not as sexy, but they do carry people, and you should never ever see a one-car in Judah, T3rd, J Church ever again. I mean, they should all be 2 to 3 vehicles, and immediately we'll expand capacity that way. Second, I talked about expanding citywide infrastructure of protected bike lanes. I really believe that, and we've seen surveys that show that more people are willing to get out of their cars and onto a bike than onto Muni, and we should absolutely be expanding the infrastructure to support people to bike. And in fact, I'm a fledgling cyclist. It is part of my commitment to drive less is by biking more. And as someone who learned to bike as an adult, I'm not really willing to bike unless there's a protected bike lane. And actually, I think almost every single protected bike lane is in my district because I fought for them. Whether it's on 7th and 8th or Folsom, we're building one on Turk right now. We're building one on 2nd Street that's coming up. And outside of Golden Gate Park, almost every single protected bike lane is in this district. And I want to see that expand citywide. And by the way, we don't need everyone to stop driving. For environmental reasons, we hope that people overall will reduce their dependence on vehicles. But just to address congestion, it doesn't take a lot of people to stop driving to make traffic work more smoothly. Transportation planners call this the Columbus Day effect, and they use Columbus Day. And by the way, I don't want to politicize the holiday, but because most people don't get it off, but some people do, and even just that 10% reduction of cars on the street, the Bay Bridge traffic moves on that day. And so if we get more people, even 10% of drivers onto bikes, that's going to help congestion in San Francisco. And finally, regionally, I'd like to see us invest in a regional ferry system that connects South Bay to San Francisco to North and East Bay. And get more people through the region commuting via ferry, because while ferries are also expensive, you don't have to build a track or underground a tunnel to get more ferries out and moving. And currently right now, I've invested prioritizing the funding of a new terminal at Mission Bay for small and large ferries and water taxis, and that will service the Warriors Arena, the Giants Stadium, the biotech companies that are there, UCSF and Kaiser.
Cool, thank you. So then getting to housing, I know that SB 827 is a huge issue. A lot of people believe that housing is sort of at crisis levels, where we are adding 10 jobs to one house or 8 jobs to one house in the San Francisco area. So we wanted to sort of hear about your opposition to 827. Are there amendments that could make it more palatable or can make it work? And like, what are the real ways to add housing without creating displacement and without harming our communities?
Yeah, so a couple of ways to kind of look at it. So currently, just within our current zoning in San Francisco, we can build 140,000 more homes, right? So currently, we're building the most housing we've ever built, which is about roughly 5,000 units of housing a year. We do need to increase that amount. 5,000 is high for San Francisco, but we need to go better than 5,000. So one is that just within our current existing envelope of zoning, we can build 140,000 more homes, and we should do that.
And we don't, because permitting is difficult to get, as I understand.
So that's not totally accurate. So we just don't get those project proposals. Housing development is very expensive in San Francisco, in large part because of the cost of land. It is the single biggest driver of housing costs in San Francisco, and actually really anywhere that you build. The single largest line item on any developer's back of the envelope sheet is the cost of land. And San Francisco land is incredibly expensive. So that's one. Two, we should talk about units that have already been entitled, therefore has gone through all the hoops, but are still not building. So there's about 45,000 units of housing that are entitled, approved, but aren't building, have not pulled a single construction permit. And so part of my thinking is, what can we do to expedite those housing units? So 30,000 is wrapped up in 7 projects throughout the city. It's Treasure Island, Candlestick, Executive Park, Park Merced. And one of the biggest hurdles actually for these developers is because their projects are so big, they also have to build out the infrastructure before they build the housing. By infrastructure, I mean sewage, electricity grid, sidewalk, transit. And so I propose that we initiate a citywide IEFD, an infrastructure financing district. It's like an infrastructure bank, where we would actually pre-finance the infrastructure on behalf of the developers so that they can start building housing more quickly. The second is actually something that then Supervisor Wiener did actually introduce, and something I strongly support, which is accessory dwelling units. We've doubled the zoning on single-family homes throughout San Francisco through our ADU program, and it allows single-family homes to both increase the value of their property by building an additional rental unit that it can either go to a family member or it can go out onto the market. And if the entire Bay Area legalized ADUs, we could build millions of homes, and we can do it affordably, because keep in mind that land is already owned by that homeowner. And an ADU costs roughly about $200,000 to $250,000 to build. The average high-rise condo in my district is $450,000 per door. So it's half the cost. So I've been thinking a lot about what can we do to expand the ADU program here in San Francisco. We can build it cheaper, more quickly. Currently, the planning department doesn't have a consistent design guideline around ADU, so that's one of the problems. So they'll say yes to one ADU and then say no to exactly the same one in another. So we have to stop that, right, and streamline that process. And two, we have to work with the fire department, which is actually having a ton of issues around egress and ingress with these issues. Finally, we have to ease what you said is the post-approval permitting process. So all the permits that are required through Public Works and QC and MTA, the mayor actually did issue a directive in September to start streamlining this process, and the departments have begun that work, but we absolutely have to make sure that that happens.
So my phone's going wild. I think we have to open to audience questions. I think we have time for one, maybe two. Does somebody want to jump in?
Hi.
Rishi, yes.
I've found that local politics traditionally in San Francisco is pretty divided. There's there's progressives and there's the moderates, and it's just continued over time, and that hasn't served the city particularly well. It bleeds down into the city itself with YIMBYism and NIMBYism and all kinds of crazy things.
Mm-hmm.
What are you going to do to bring to bring people together?
I actually think political discourse and debate is a good thing. I really don't think that's a bad thing at all. Of course, it's not good when it becomes emotional and personal. But if you look at the Board of Supervisors, if you watch our meetings on Tuesday, I would say 97% of our votes are unanimous. And I actually don't think that there is a lot of discord actually between the moderates and progressives on the board. We don't like each other, actually. We may disagree on some controversial votes, and we'll have really, I think very good debates on issues around housing and transportation. But I don't think the debate is bad as long as it doesn't get personal. And I have not found in my time on the board that it really gets down to that level. To be honest, this is just my perspective. Now, the media is a totally different thing. The media needs controversy. So when you read about us in the Chronicle, it seems like we're fighting every single day. But that's not actually, I think, a very accurate perspective or image of this board. And I feel like if you ask any of my colleagues, they'll tell you that we primarily get along. I actually, London and I, we go out for drinks. Like, we really like each other. We may not agree on everything, but we have a very good relationship, and we've found a lot of issues that we've been able to work on together.
Yeah, great.
Maybe a follow-up to Ruchi's. I want to press on the 9 of you in the board may get along fine in City Hall, but I live in the Mission, and I work in technology, and I think there are a lot of community activists there that would really like to see me move out, and all of my friends, and in what gets painted on the sidewalks and what gets printed in the sort of local newspaper. They're really not shy about that. So I think there is pretty significant discord that is happening in the city, even if it's not happening in City Hall.
So, I will say this, and I think it's really a challenge to both sides, right? It's a challenge to you and also to the neighborhood activists. It's really just to, I know it sounds so simplistic and Pollyanna-ish, but it really is to get to know each other. And we in the city have experienced a growth over the last 6 to 7 years where we've grown 100,000 residents in a very short period of time. That's like New York City growing 1 million residents, right? Proportionally. And really very few cities have experienced this type of growth in a very short period of time, at least kind of in this modern era. And when a lot of new people come in, people do get displaced. That is actually something that's been happening. And in particular, we have been losing a lot of our Latino community members in the Mission, and certainly our African American community has largely been decimated here in San Francisco. And people have a lot of feelings about that, and I think those are valid feelings. And I think it's important to acknowledge that is happening and just participating in your neighborhood. And so what I've often told a lot of our newer companies that have come in, our newer workers, is just to get involved in your neighborhood. When you go to the neighborhood meetings, when you build those relationships, and you also show that you're willing to kind of roll up your sleeves and get things done in the community, I think that does improve tensions. I really do. And I remember, was it 2 years ago, they started these happy hours where they brought folks, community activists, and quote-unquote tech workers together. Tech workers, by the way, is a very broad category of folks. But, to kind of dialogue more and talk about how we can solve these problems together. But you're right, there is tension. I'm not going to not acknowledge that exists, but I think we just have to do a lot more community building.
Yeah, we do have time for a few more questions, so I want to get to you.
So from 2010 to 2015, 6.8 new jobs were created for each new housing unit, and it seems like compared to major other cities, the ratio is much worse. How can San Francisco improve that ratio, whether that's through reform at the state level, such that tax revenue, because as you know, tax revenue comes largely through sales and property taxes on the local basis. Well, if you add new housing, you're going to have to pay for schools and other services for these new residents. In Central Soma alone, we had 50,000 new jobs created, but only 7,000 new housing units. So how can we going forward encourage cities like San Francisco to add new housing to keep up with that jobs that are created?
Yeah, so Central Soma is just a very small percentage of the parcels in San Francisco, and if we're going to build office, it's going to be in the downtown area. It's not going to be on the west side, for example. The vast majority of San Francisco is zone residential. And so you kind of have to look at the citywide jobs housing balance. Now, even on that, we're not doing well, by the way. So I'm not excusing Central Soma. I'm just saying Central Soma alone, there is going to be a jobs housing imbalance just in that small sector of the South Market.
And if you look at just San Francisco, it is 8 jobs to housing units or 10 jobs to housing units over the portion. It's not just Central Soma, right? If you look at San Francisco, if you look at San Francisco County and San Mateo County, if you look at the whole area, there's definitely more jobs and housing units, right? Yes.
San Francisco is doing by far the best, by the way. I forget if it's 1.2 or something along those lines, but we're doing far better. how do we get people to build more housing? I think one, you have to fund more affordable and middle-income housing again, like we did between 1940 and 1980. We simply have to invest more subsidies into housing because housing is just very expensive to build. And if every housing unit in San Francisco costs $450,000 a door, you know who they're going to be renting and selling to. It's not going to be for your teachers and your nurses. In fact, it's not even be entry-level tech workers. I mean, you guys can't afford those units. The average market rate unit that's going out today, and this is not luxury, I'm not talking about Four Seasons or the Millennium, is priced for families of four that make $270,000 a year, right? So that is far above what most people in San Francisco are making. And so our current rental market is just not meeting the needs of middle class and working class families. And at the point that we're at right now, it is going to require additional subsidies, both from the state and the feds. We locally are doing our part. We passed a $310 million affordable housing bond a couple of years ago, and we do deeply invest in affordable housing, much more than any other locality does. But it's just frankly not enough. Two, and this is something I've been doing work on. I serve on the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, which is a 9-county body of the Bay Area. We're trying to link more transportation funds to actual production of housing. So, like Contra Costa County is actually the worst example. They build almost no housing. But they depend on MTC for repaving their highways like the 680 and 101. And so we've been trying to link more of that funding to their actual production of housing. So it's both a carrot and a stick at the same time. And I think the state could do a lot more of that, actually.
I guess I don't understand how you would drastically increase the housing available without having the zoning regulations change so that everything's a lot taller. You say that the cost of land is a huge cost for developers, and so shouldn't we be using more of it to?
No, unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. So, if you're a land, sorry.
So just a quick comment. We have 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. So if you already own the land and you intend to develop on it, and you suddenly get 10 additional floors, then yes, suddenly the cost of building housing becomes much more affordable. But what normally happens is someone owns the land, doesn't plan to build on it, and a developer's out on the market trying to buy it. And I upzone that land 10 stories, well, that landowner is going to charge 10 times what it was worth the previous day. So, I always state that I've negotiated and built more affordable middle-income housing than any city legislator in the last 7 years. How I have done that is by upzoning parcels that are already owned by those developers. So the Giants, which was the first project sponsor that committed to building 40% middle-income housing on site, we dramatically upzoned their parcel, but it was already under their site control, if that makes sense. So when we upzone, once you kind of come to us with a project, then you can build. Then we are kind of we're conferring value to land, basically, right?
Jane, I was wondering what's limiting upzoning. From my point of view, I would just upzone the whole city as much as possible, and then have all at once. I'm sure some people would put their prices up, but if you did it all at once, I think that would be pretty awesome. The developer could then buy the other one.
It's supply and demand. Yeah. Right? Okay, they charge more, but
it's not supply and demand we don't know the accurate number, but the planners estimate that anywhere between 13 to 25% of all units that get built don't house anyone because it's a real estate investment in San Francisco.
Then on the prices keep going up. Get more supply, and the prices come down.
Well, I don't know. I don't know how.
Why can't we upzone the whole city?
So we have upzoned most of the city, but zoning alone doesn't build housing. So I already said within our existing capacity, we can build 140,000 more homes. That hasn't increased the proposals that come to us because there's multiple barriers to building housing. One of them is stuff like this. Like you look at South Park, right? I could upzone everything to 10 stories here, but no one's actually going to demolish an existing building and evict those tenants and families in order to build the additional 8 stories, right? Most of San Francisco is built out. Now it's true on soft sites. What? Oh.
I feel like people would evict tenants and build bigger.
Well, we don't want that. we don't want to evict our existing residents in order to build 10 more stories. So we're trying to build more without displacing people.
But
Now, if we
there
were-
10 more stories of housing, then there would be enough space for those residents, and then
No, that's never what happens.
Well, S27 actually had provisions for allowing people who were evicted to live in that area. So would you support A27 in that capacity?
I don't support Sacramento doing local land use regulation. What I would support is Sacramento saying, hey, we won't give you more funding until you build this many more units of housing, and let those cities figure out how to build that additional housing. I think that local land use control should stay under local purview, but I'm okay with getting a carrot or stick, saying if you don't meet this goal by this year, you're not going to get this, 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 and this. And then letting the localities figure out how they're going to achieve that goal. That I would support, but just upzoning a city doesn't build more housing.
But
But
cities haven't built the quota that they're supposed to build. I mean, this is
We don't have a quota. We only have goals.
We haven't built.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
And by the way, San Francisco is one of the few cities that's actually meeting our RENA goals. But the problem is that it's a goal. So what I'm saying is have the state actually link our goal to actual, cost, right, to the city. And Sacramento absolutely can do that. I think that's a better way to build. So let the localities figure out how to build the housing, but actually put some real, stick on if we don't build.
Okay, do we have a question over here? A couple hands. Teresa?
Yeah, so there has been a lot of below market rate units built in Soma, and a lot of the times, instead of having it be in the same building with additional floors allocated, it's relegated to a stretch around 6th Street in Soma. And it feels like there's like a ghettoization of that area. That's, why is it that developers are able to put their below market rate units and therefore their connection to, people who are a little bit different from themselves further away and cut off that connection?
So actually, I don't know the percentage offhand, but most developments actually do build their affordable housing on site. So NEMA, their affordable housing is on site. AVA's affordable housing on site. Giants will be building theirs on site. 160 Folsom, which is in construction right now, which actually we granted 10 additional 100 feet to. They're building all of their middle income housing units on site. We do in a very kind of narrow group of developments allow developers to build their units off site. It tends to be for luxury condos. Because by state law, we're not allowed to provide lower HOA fees for the below market rate homeowners. And so what happened actually in South Beach is that we had a lot of homeowners that want a BMR home ownership unit, but couldn't afford the HOA fee. And so ended up losing their homes anyway. And it's a huge problem with the state law. So state law doesn't allow us to differentiate or scale HOA fees. And so we've, in those instances where developers are building fairly expensive home ownership condos, have allowed them to offsite their units. But rentals tend to build on-site. 6th Street is different. There is no offsite on 6th Street. Everything that we have built on 6th Street has been almost 100% publicly subsidized. Either through redevelopment or through some kind of housing trust fund by the city. Or there's single room occupancy hotels that were built back in 1906 that we have maintained as affordable housing.
But in that region, there are a number of units or a number of buildings. Right?
None that market rate developers offsited.
So is it a difference between public housing and affordable units?
Yes. Okay. So our affordable housing program has a couple of different components. So one is the ones that the developers build, right? They are either on site or, you're right, within a quarter-mile radius of their development. Others are 100% affordable housing developments that we, the city, build, either through redevelopment, which no longer exists as a tool, or through our affordable housing bonds, state, federal, HUD grants, et cetera.
So we have time for, I think, one more question. We have about 2 more minutes.
Oh, let's start with Dylan and see if we can get him out.
Oh, so when it comes to election, my choice is between you and London Breed.
Okay.
And so when it comes to the issue of building more housing that is not affordable housing, that's housing that's controlled by market, what are the differences between the two of you?
No one has built more housing than I have on the board, market rate or affordable housing. And I see like the critiques on social media that all of this housing was approved before I got on the board. That is absolutely not true. I have shepherded every single one of these projects through personally and have supported them and negotiated those projects so they could get to approval. And I've done that with actual opposition from neighborhood leaders in my district. So they haven't, I try the best that I can to get as much support for the projects as possible, and in most cases I have. But there have been controversial projects like 5M and 160 Folsom where we did actually get strong opposition to the upzoning that we did in exchange for building more affordable and middle income housing. I also, I will say this, and it's not a totally fair thing to say, but no one understands land use as housing amongst the mayoral candidates as well as I do. And I say that not because I'm better or anything like that. It's just simply because that's what my work has been over the last 7 years. I represent a district that is doing all the development in San Francisco. So I simply had to understand planning code and land use issues and housing issues. And that's why, I talk so much about it.
Matt, do you want to?
Yeah, just really quickly. So earlier when you were sort of laying out sort of your future proposals for increasing housing, two of the big things that you mentioned were the infrastructure development fund for sort of things that are permitted but not built out because the infrastructure is not there. And then the other one was basically sort of additional units on people's existing property. And so it seems kind of strange to rely either on like trying to push housing to areas that don't have infrastructure, or kind of rely on huge numbers of people doing this very capital intensive thing that is probably going to disrupt their lives a lot in order to bring up housing. Is there any way to kind of do this in a more scalable fashion where the infrastructure already exists?
It doesn't require a city
No.
supervisor to make it happen.
No. I mean, well, actually, the 140,000 units of housing that I talked about, that's already in our zoning. So that can proposals can start coming in for those developments.
How much
Now,
how does that break down among sort of the permanent stuff that needs the infrastructure and the additional units and people?
Every new housing needs additional infrastructure. Our city is not scaled for more than 700,000 people. Our infrastructure already is not meeting the needs of all the housing that we're currently building. So there is no way to permit more housing without also funding more infrastructure. That's just impossible. So any new housing we build will require more buses, more transit, more parks, more schools, all of that, right? So there's no neighborhood where the infrastructure exceeds the housing that's already been built or exists there. Now, I brought up the 30,000 units of housing that are entitled in 7 major projects in the city. And those projects have to get built. It's Park Merced, it's Treasure Island, it's Candlestick Executive Park, Hopesep, Slage Lock. And those plans all have infrastructure built into it. And when we negotiated those deals, and it made sense at the time, we asked the developers to pre-finance that infrastructure because they can do it more cheaply and more quickly than the city can.
So the supervisor regularly has a meeting too.
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. But I'll finish this question. So we have to build the infrastructure. There's just no way getting around it. I understand what you mean about like us depending on homeowners to build an additional ADU, but we already depend on developers building more development based on our zoning already. So I don't know if I completely agree with that. And I also think that because those units can get built more affordably and more quickly than kind of all the high rises in my district can, we should absolutely be encouraging homeowners to do it. And so maybe it's about creating more incentives. So maybe we can do, and something we've been kind of tossing back and forth at the board is maybe we should do like a 5-year tax rebate for homeowners that decide to do an ADU. So we know that sometimes homeowners are concerned about paying more property taxes. So why don't we do a 5-year moratorium on your taxes so you can build out an ADU, get some revenue from it before you pay the higher property taxes. But by the way, I'm open to more ideas on how we can incentivize housing here in San Francisco. But I do think that funding infrastructure is going to be a big part of it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate all of your time. There's another debate after this with all of the mayoral candidates, but also after June 5th, I'm happy to come back to continue this conversation.
Cool.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you all so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Let me just get your couple.